Welcome to GitOps the Planet, episode 9. We're going to be talking about how vCluster is changing the game. I am your host, as always, Dan Garfield. I am the co-founder and chief open source officer of CodeFresh. I am an Argo project maintainer. I'm also the co-chair of the GitOps working group and Open GitOps, the GitOps for standard under the CNCF. Today I'm excited because we're going to be talking about vCluster. We're going to talk about how it's changing DevOps, how it's changing Kubernetes, how it's changing CI/CD. We're going to talk about how we're using it. And I have an amazing panel of folks that are going to be on to help me do that. Let me bring them on. And first, I'm going to add in, let's add in Rich first. Rich, you want to say hello? You're on mute.
Really good to see you again, Dan. Hi.
Good to see you, Rich. And this is Lian. Lian, she's on your team, I think.
Yeah,
I am for now. I did not wear the uniform. That's what I'm saying.
Oh, you're usually the one who does wear the uniform.
I know.
I got you this time.
I thought there's the three of us, so it's gonna be fine. Everyone knows where we're from.
And then we also have Oleg from the Loft team as well.
Hello. Hey.
Well, I'm excited
Oleg,
to have all of you.
Oleg is one of the maintainers of vCluster and like one of the main people who work on it a lot. So we should be able to pick his brain some.
Oh, fantastic. Excellent. Okay. So yeah, I think I want to talk about kind of a wide range of topics related to vCluster. But first of all, for those that aren't familiar with vCluster, and that's not that many people in the chat, I already see Engine is kicking off the vCluster fan club.
Hey, again.
So just give us a brief intro to vCluster and why it exists and its use cases.
Yeah, I'll go. So vCluster actually came out of some things that our co-founders were building, right? And they wanted multi-tenancy. Typically in the past, people have either done namespace-based isolation, which really has, limitations, or they just give everybody their own cluster, which is kind of problematic in a lot of ways. And so they came up with this idea. It was actually based on some work oh gosh, how am I spacing his name? I'll think of it, but basically there was a sort of a proof of concept of having this idea of like a virtual cluster. And so they kind of took K3S and they stuck it in a namespace basically and said, you're going to connect to the API server inside of the namespace and use it as if it was its own cluster.
And as far as the use cases go, people used to just scope permissions around namespace, but this allows you to go quite a bit deeper because you can basically just create a separate cluster within a cluster, right? And as far as the performance impact of doing that, like if I'm doing Docker and Docker, I have an extra, Docker socket that I have to I have to pass it through, and it's going to take a little bit more resources than just running a container directly. What about vCluster? What's my performance impact of running a vCluster?
Oleg, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. So for the workloads, there is no performance impact basically, because under the hood, the pod that you want to run in the vCluster will run in the host cluster, and there is no like virtualization layer sort of in between. So performance is basically native, and then you maybe have to consider performance against API server, which might be actually better, because if you have one host cluster where you have tons of teams and everyone is, swarming the control plane API server, you will see some increase of the performance. But if you create a vCluster, you get a dedicated API server for that.
This is one of the really interesting impacts of vCluster, is that in many ways it actually makes Kubernetes more scalable. because
I mean, I don't think that part was even intended, right? Like when we built the thing, it was really a lot more about, trying to solve these multi-tenancy issues. And then we sort of got this API federation as like a nice side effect of that. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, there's a couple of use cases that come to mind for me, and first of all, I got my vCluster T-shirt over here. I decided not to wear it because I thought it might be confusing, so I'm keeping my Argo shirt on so that there's no confusion about which team I'm on. But I do have my Loft water bottle at the ready, just in case. So the use cases that I think are really interesting, and we actually use it internally, and I've given a couple KubeCon talks with Adobe where they're using vCluster. So I've actually used vCluster quite a few times. One of the ways that I used it, and I'm going to be talking about it at KubeCon in Europe, is for performance testing of Argo CD. So we actually have a tool inside of Argo CD. It's in our hack folder. And basically what it does is it allows you to spawn massive amounts of resources into Argo CD so you can do performance testing. And the way that we do it is we actually create vClusters, because one of the API metrics for Argo CD is how many clusters can I manage, and how do I need to, at which point do I need to increase the number of repo servers running so that I have, scalability on that. And so I've spun up tens of thousands of vClusters to throw at Argo CD to see what happens. So that's one case where I'm using it literally just for performance testing. But another use case, and this is one that has been pretty well publicized, is that CodeFresh itself uses vCluster. So I thought I might take a second to just show you what that looks like.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah,
I have to say, we were so excited when we heard about this. I think that you all were like the first people that we were aware of who had taken vCluster and used it in their own like SaaS offering. Super cool.
Oh yeah. So the way that we do this, and I'm going to make sure that I don't share any information that I'm not supposed to. It should be okay. But I'm currently sitting inside of my CodeFresh account, and I'm just going to show you really quick my runtime environments. And if you look in this topology here, I have a CodeFresh hosted runtime. Now, this is basically the enterprise version of Argo CD that's running here, and CodeFresh hosts these. Now, Argo CD itself is generally, it's got single sign-on, it's got role-based access controls. However, you wouldn't want to make an Argo CD instance available to like anyone on the internet. It's just beyond the permission scope. It's like, you wouldn't want to give the Kubernetes API to anybody on the internet either. It's just like, yeah, I'm just not comfortable with it. So what we do is every account in CodeFresh gets one of these hosted instances that they can use. And you can see mine is managing 2 clusters over here. And the way that we do this is we actually spin up a vCluster for each account, and then we put essentially Argo CD and the CodeFresh components into that vCluster. And Kostas, who's on my team, amazing guy, CodePipes on Twitter, should definitely follow him. His content's incredible. He did a great blog post running through and explaining the whole architecture for how we do this. So we basically just have a vCluster running on a larger cluster. We use Crossplane to manage and spin these all up. So what happens when a user signs up for CodeFresh and they click enable runtime, it actually makes a git commit into a private, CodeFresh repository, which then will spin up all the resources and then attach it onto that user's account, so they can just go and start, deploying applications, and they don't have to. Wait,
so you manage it with Argo? This is kind of turtles all the way down, huh?
It's turtles all the way down. We use Argo to manage. We use Argo plus Crossplane, making it get commit to trigger the spin up and of all these components, and then make them available to the user. So the end result is, if I'm in my account, I can go, and if I'm looking at like my applications here, I can view all of my applications. These are all on the hosted runtime. I can look at my prod instance. I can view my timeline of deployments that have happened. I can handle my canary releases, all that stuff. And all of that is just hosted for me. So I don't have to host it. I don't have to manage it. It's self-updating. It's self-managing. So I just, basically get it for free. And this is really only possible because of vCluster. So I'll throw in the chat for the users that want to read the deep dive, the blog post that goes deeper on this stuff. But that's essentially how we're using it. So, that gives you a couple of different ways that I've used it. Argo CD performance testing. We use it in production to actually manage everybody's Argo CD instances. And this brings me to kind of the first topic that I wanted to cover, which was really security. Because we're doing this with vCluster so that we have isolation and each instance is running on its own. So is this a secure setup, based on what you've seen? Is this something that you guys are stoked about, or do you think that we need to be doing maybe some extra stuff? And I won't tell you necessarily all the things we're doing from a security perspective to make this secure on the back end. There's a little bit of security and obscurity as far as don't want to give a guide map to anybody. But what would we maybe be worried about, or should this just generally be considered safe?
Do you want to take this one, Oleg? Oh, go, Lian.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I was gonna just give the short answer, which is no, and then defer to Oleg for the long answer.
Yeah, okay. Well, usually if you were to write in Slack, if your setup is safe, I would ask you for your values for the Helm chart and so on. But if we just try to build up from the defaults, the default setup is not safe for this kind of purpose, because you are still sharing the host cluster networks between all the pods. And if you are able to guess like the IP address of other pods, you may be able to access them. By default, no like pod security standards are enforced and so on. But because this isolation is one of the like popular use cases, we since I don't know, half a year ago, maybe a bit more, added a few flags that will make this easier. So on our documentation page, we have a chapter about security, and there is isolated mode called out, and that one should tighten the security quite a lot, because it will enforce the pod security standards that you define. It can even do if the Kubernetes version that you want to use in the vCluster doesn't support it. We do it at the vCluster level, not necessarily the Kubernetes API level. It can also do the networking isolation. So it relies on the host cluster having network interface that supports network policies. And then the vCluster will create a network policy that should isolate it from all other workloads in the host cluster. And yeah, it also provides a few like other things like setting up quotas for resources and so on in the namespace while you are deploying the vCluster. But of course, you can add more on top of that.
So assuming that I have my networking configured properly and maybe some other isolation things going on, and I'm in this case, we're also not giving people access to the Kubernetes API. They actually can't deploy anything to that Kubernetes cluster. There's just the Argo CD instance that's running. So under that setup, we would consider it safe, assuming that we've taken all those steps and we've done some hardening.
I think with the isolated mode, yes, and but I mean, again, it's still a shared cluster, right? So you still want to do all the other sort of practices you would want to do to secure a shared cluster, like admission control and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, when it comes to running vCluster in a potentially adversarial environment, I think the worst case scenario is you get to some kind of container breakout. because if you do get to container breakout, they could potentially go beyond just the virtual cluster, because really it's just a pod that's running on the cluster. It just happens to be managed by a virtual cluster, right?
Yeah, but this pod security standards is the part that's supposed to prevent that. So like deny pods trying to run as root and attaching capabilities from the Linux kernel. Yeah, this sort of thing, or like mounting the host file system. So if you set, I know, restricted, I think is the highest level of pod security standard, this should also be prevented. Like your setup, I actually didn't realize it first, is probably quite secure with the default settings as well, because the users cannot deploy anything in that cluster. What I was describing is already like protections against like users that can deploy things inside.
Yeah, it's definitely, and I think for most users, they're not necessarily using vCluster in adversarial environments, but I bring that up because you can do it and you can have it be secure, and you just need to take the steps. And so the fact that it's secure to that level makes me also feel a lot more comfortable, where most people, they're not deploying it in those kinds of environments. They're using it across maybe developer teams or things like that. In the case of Adobe, and I did a talk with Joseph Sandoval, who's an amazing Kubernetes maintainer and release lead. And he's over at Adobe implementing all kinds of great stuff. His team has put together a really interesting use case where they basically spin up vClusters for teams when they need to deploy applications as an extra layer of isolation beyond just scoping to a namespace, which is, I think, what a lot of people would do, is they just would create a namespace. So is that something you could talk about, is like deploying it into a scoped namespace versus deploying it to vCluster? Do you recommend people do both for spreading out among teams, or what's the best approach for that kind of stuff? For whomever wants that one.
I guess I'm not clear what you mean by a scope namespace.
Oh, so like a lot of teams, what they'll do is they'll be like, hey, this development team, they get their own namespace. Every development team gets their own namespace. They can deploy their stuff there, and we scope permissions to it, so they can only deploy to that namespace. And there's maybe some, security policy about what networking between namespaces and stuff like that is allowed. So that's been the common pattern, and I kind of feel like vCluster is replacing that. But I don't know. Maybe I'm not seeing the whole picture. So I'm curious if you've seen anything different.
I mean, I think it all depends on, your threat model and stuff too. Like we were talking about earlier, in your scenario, you might treat things differently than someone else would, where people were deploying workloads. But I think that defense in depth is really good, right? Like I think that's a big part of security, is that you don't want to just rely on one thing to provide like all your security, and then if somebody can bypass that, they're in. And so when Oleg was talking about the pod security policies, and the fact that you could deny privilege pods, I would still do that in admission control too, right? Just so that for sure that it's going to happen. And
This is another thing that I actually think is really cool about vCluster, is if I'm using something like OPA Gatekeeper or Kyverno on my parent cluster, and this is something that Joseph Sandoval from Adobe brought up, you can have that security policy in place of like, hey, I want to have my containers signed. I want to have, I don't want them to ever run privileged or whatever. I can implement that as a single policy on my parent cluster, and then all the vCluster, they just have to obey it, because a pod can't be admitted if it doesn't meet those security policies. So that admission controller, it's going to take effect, and I don't have to re-implement it on every single vCluster. So there's sort of a inheritance to these vClusters.
Yeah, that's correct.
Do you want to talk about that, Lian?
I don't even know what to talk about there. Is there a question in that?
Well, I mean, I think that, I think you're right, Dan. It's because the actual workloads are getting scheduled on the underlying cluster, right? That you're getting the benefit of all of that security you're doing on the underlying cluster. And so, like I said, I would definitely recommend people do admission control. If they're doing admission control on that level, then, if the vCluster tries to schedule a pod that, goes against the admission control policies, it's still going to get rejected, even though it's getting scheduled, like, it's getting created in the virtual cluster.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's like just a great benefit to using vCluster. I want to go to use cases for a minute. So like, what are some of the more interesting use cases you've seen? Obviously, you all said that CodeFresh's use case was the most interesting and the best use case and just the top-notch one above all others. But putting that one aside, we've already accepted that. And maybe, Lian, can we start with you? Because we've been, I feel like we haven't given you a chance to talk too much.
That's all right. No, that's all right. I do actually have something to contribute to this conversation. I've been talking to a couple of people about multi-tenancy on Kubernetes at some conferences, and there were a lot of interesting use cases. I think the one that I found most interesting is a company that does basically DevOps as a service, more or less. So they will host and manage all the workloads of their customers, and they use vCluster in production for that. So they want their customers obviously isolated from each other, but they do have these shared security policies, and they also use, I think, maybe Cert Manager. Not quite sure if it was that or something else, but they use this shared instance and they share that into the vClusters themselves. So I think that, and then also the most interesting thing about that is that they were running it on OpenShift, which I didn't know was possible. Last time I used OpenShift, nothing was possible there. So I found that to be really impressive as a use case.
Yeah, that's an awesome one. And are there some other standouts, Rich?
I think in terms of like the basic use cases that we hear a lot about, dev environments is a really big one. CI/CD pipelines, I think, is a really, really good use case, right? Because a lot of times when you're building a test suite, you want to have, at points in your tests, you want to just throw everything away and start again with a fresh environment. And if you're doing that with, clusters that you're provisioning from a cloud provider, you're maybe waiting around, 20 minutes for that cluster to move on to the next set of tests. And so being able to use these sort of ephemeral virtual clusters instead is really powerful. I think that another really interesting one is you could potentially test against different versions of Kubernetes. And this is something that I think we were on Raw Code Live a long time ago and talked to David, and he came up with this thought of, say you're developing an operator, you could test that operator against multiple versions of Kubernetes using these virtual clusters.
Yeah, because the vClusters don't need to match the parent cluster version. They can be running whatever version. So I can spin up, let's say as part of a CI/CD pipeline, I can spin up 8 different versions of Kubernetes, maybe more realistically like 4, and then deploy everything to all those different, clusters and see how it goes and make sure my testing is actually going to work. And this is another interesting thing going into CI/CD, and we see this a lot. CodeFresh is a CI/CD company. We have a lot of CodeFresh CI/CD users, but we see a lot of people using vCluster because when they want a test cluster, I can use EKS and I can spin up a new cluster and it's going to take 20 minutes. But if I already have an EKS cluster and I throw up a vCluster onto it, it's going to take 30 seconds, especially if I've already have a vCluster there. So it's already pulled the images that it needs. It's going to take, in the order of a few seconds versus tens of minutes. So just the performance of using vCluster in these testing scenarios to spin up and spin down, tear down infrastructure or whatever, it's so efficient for that CI/CD is an amazing use case for it.
Yeah,
if you only pay for one control plane. Oh, sorry, Rich.
Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah, absolutely. I actually just wrote a vCluster tutorial on our website. So if people haven't used it, if you go to loft.sh and click on the blog link, it's in the top few posts. But it just kind of walks you through the basics of using vCluster. And if you try this, what you're going to see is that it literally just takes a few seconds to spin up these virtual clusters. and to destroy them as well, as you mentioned. And so it's what I tell people when I'm talking about use cases is like, boy, would you like the cluster to spin up faster? I think there are a ton of use cases where people would really like that. Or would you like to save some money, and not deploy 1,000 clusters when you could, do 20 or something? And so, I think there are a ton of use cases that people can take advantage of vCluster in.
I do love that you can pause workloads and resume them. You can just pause the cluster and resume it when you need it.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that another use case that maybe is mostly interesting to us is that I use vCluster for my demos, for talks, and then I will set them up, long before, and then I can pause them, and I just resume them when I give my talk, right? So that maybe something that, for demos and for workshops and all of those things, because then you can like multiply them and just hand them to people more or less, and that I find super useful.
And
I was just going to say the way the pausing and resuming works is pretty cool. So it works on stateful sets and replica sets. And what it does is it just sets the number of replicas to 0. And so it makes an annotation of how many replicas were there, and it sets it to 0. So basically, everything's still configured. It's all still there. It's just that the workloads go away, including the pod that vCluster is in. And then when you do the resume, it just sets the number of replicas back, and everything just spins right back up. So it's a really, really easy way to put things to sleep. But I mean, again, because it's so fast and easy to like destroy and provision these things, that's another option too, is just to throw stuff away and do it again.
Yeah, and with these, would you just have the parent cluster maybe have just an autoscaler on it, so that if you need more nodes, it'll just add nodes as you need them? But then underlying to vCluster, it's just, hey, I'm just scheduling pods. Like I don't actually have to care about the number of nodes per se, even though I might be essentially emulating so many. Like, how does that work? I guess in vCluster, do I can't remember now. Do I specify a number of nodes, or and it emulates those nodes, or do I just inherit the nodes that are from the parent cluster? Or how does that work?
Do you want to talk about nodes, Oleg?
Yeah, this is actually configurable. So vCluster is like very flexible. So we have too many configuration options, in my opinion. Like I have to maintain it. Yeah. So you can either like hide the nodes, and basically whenever a pod is scheduled in the host cluster, it will be scheduled to one of the nodes, and then that node becomes visible in the vCluster. So if one of the vCluster pods is running on the node, it will be visible in the vCluster, but only like very limited amount of information, basically what you can get from the pod status. Or you can say that, okay, I want my vCluster users to be able to see all of the nodes from the host cluster, or maybe some subset, like with the label selector, and then vCluster will make those nodes visible inside, like to the vCluster users. And yeah, that's like the options for that.
Yeah, so the scalability isn't going to really be an issue, because I'm going to be able to take advantage of whatever's there, and then the underlying, parent cluster can just schedule more nodes if it needs to, and put those workloads where it needs. So it just feels whatever this pressure is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And also in this regard, I mentioned that you can set a label selector, which will, show some nodes to the users. It can also be used to force all the pods of that vCluster only into the nodes with this label selector. So, for example, you can, create a preview vCluster for preview environments. This is also a cool use case because it starts so quickly. And say, okay, here is a node pool of spot nodes that will be cheap, and this is a preview environment. I don't care that much, about stability of it. And then, everything that's deployed inside goes to only these select nodes.
Yeah, so another thing that I wanted to bring up and talk about with vCluster is an emerging pattern. I'm curious if you've seen this and if this is going to be replicated in more places. But in the case of CERN, these are the black hole people. They produce black holes. I think that's not how they would describe it. They run a large hadron collider and they mash atoms together and they collect tons of data.
I'm not sure anyone would work there if they produce black holes at CERN.
I think they do produce mini black holes that like their lifespan.
They collapse instantly.
Yeah,
I
they
think
collapse
that's
instantly.
the idea.
So they're not a threat to the entire planet.
Famous last words.
Knock on wood. I did see a news report one time where they were speculating if a plane had been perhaps gobbled up by a black hole, and maybe we just don't know. And I that really got my head scratching about how that would be possible. But anyway, so in the case of CERN, one of the things that they've adopted as a pattern is the idea of ephemeral clusters, and I think most people aren't comfortable with this. I have a long-running cluster. I've got my home lab behind me. You can see a couple of my nodes here. This is obviously not an ephemeral cluster because if it goes down, I'm not going to throw away the nodes and install new ones. But the idea of ephemeral infrastructure all the way down to the Kubernetes layer is something that CERN has been doing, because when they want to upgrade Kubernetes, they don't upgrade Kubernetes. They spin up a new cluster with all of their workloads, and they have an external load balancer, and they just switch things over to this new cluster. So the idea of, hey, I want to upgrade my cluster, I want to make significant changes, I'm actually just going to spin up entirely new infrastructure and throw away the old Kubernetes cluster, that seems to be an emergent pattern. Is that something that you're seeing? And I feel like vCluster really enables that in a much easier way, even though my parent cluster, maybe that's long-lived, but my vCluster is running whatever versions of Kubernetes. Is that something you're seeing, and what are some of the implications of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, gosh, I remember being at conferences 10 years ago where people were talking about immutable infrastructure, and the benefits of it. And I think it's so true, I spent a lot of time in the config management world, and when you're worrying about config drift and those kinds of problems, a lot of that stuff goes away if you just are always, redeploying stuff from scratch. One of the big limitations there is, again, the time to provision stuff, right? So if you want to spin up a new cluster every time that you do a deploy of your app to it, then your big limiting factor in terms of how quickly you can do that is how long it takes to provision the cluster. And so again, being in a position where you can have that happen in seconds instead of 20 minutes is really huge.
Yeah, I don't know if I've seen that specifically with vCluster users, but I know that in the past I was consulting for a couple of bigger companies who were basically, their goal was that their disaster recovery would be so good that they could just use it in production all the time, which I think is kind of like what you're getting at. So the goal is really like, can you spin up the current state of all your applications from nothing, like on one moment's notice, and then use that for both, just regular production, but also for disaster recovery. I don't think they ever made it this far, but that was the holy grail.
Yeah, I mean, it feels to me like there's actually a benefit in running even just a normal, even if you're just running one cluster, even just putting that inside of vCluster, it does feel like there's a benefit, because already I've expanded the API. So now the Kubernetes API is going to be not getting hit as often with my workloads, and I can manage, that separately. And then if I wanted to do an upgrade, I can do just a new cluster on top of this parent cluster. What about we mentioned running multiple versions of vCluster, multiple versions of Kubernetes. Is there a limitation from the parent version? So if I'm running let's say, what are we on now? It's like 1.24. Let's say I'm running like 1.22 on the parent cluster. Is there any problem with me running 1.24 vCluster? So I feel like I could always go down, but can I go forward as well? Is that going to be an issue?
Yeah, I probably answer this one.
Yes, please.
Sometimes you can hit like new features that basically cannot be backward compatible. So I think maybe in the versions you described, this would be the case. So in like maybe 124, there was ephemeral containers feature added to Kubernetes. vCluster can support that, but it requires the host cluster to support it as well. So like these small like exceptions do exist, but overall Kubernetes has been pretty stable. So there is like really just a few cases like this.
So it's just the case of like I'm trying to take advantage of an underlying feature, like an ephemeral pod or whatever. That okay, yeah, that I'm ultimately vCluster is just letting it schedule the pod. So if that's not available, it's not going to be available just because vCluster is there. Even though the vCluster API is like, hey, I know how to handle it, but the parent cluster doesn't, so it can't get scheduled. So that makes sense. I mean, it doesn't seem like
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Oleg, but I think that we even my camera is really blurry. I think that we even fix some things like API deprecations, like in the vCluster code itself. Am I right about that?
Oh yeah. So if the host cluster, for example, is using previous version of Ingress API, I think that was like one of the popular use cases. I think we were able to handle that difference between the virtual and the host, or like the pod security standards that I mentioned. This is like sort of going the other way. If the virtual cluster uses some older version that doesn't support this, we implemented it at the vCluster level to still like enforce this. But mainly like vCluster relies on like very basic features, pods, services, config map, secrets, this sort of stuff, which have been pretty stable in Kubernetes. So this like is quite rare to find these exceptions.
And does it warn users, or is there some sort of like if it's trying to schedule an ephemeral pod and that's not supported by the parent cluster, is it gonna? I mean, I guess it would just show up on the pod that like this type isn't supported or something, because it would just pass through from what the parent cluster got.
Oh yeah, good question. I don't remember exactly what happens with the ephemeral container. I think in the status of the pod or in the events, it will be just reporting that it cannot start. So it will be visible to the user, but the API doesn't prevent you to like create the container and it will be visible in the spec, but it will just not start.
And if I did like a dry run server, it would catch it as well, I would expect. I mean, I think we would run against the full API and see that pod can't be scheduled, and it would report that event back. So it doesn't seem like there's necessarily anything special that I would expect vCluster to do in those cases. I mean, as long as it's not like hiding the messages or something, which seems like a proactive thing you would have to build, then it's going to be fine.
To be honest, I don't think the dry run would say to you that this would be a problem, because at that point you are talking to the virtual API server, and vCluster will only
trying to actually schedule the stuff.
Yeah,
right.
Oh, so that might be a feature request, is when running dry run, please pass on the request to the parent API and pass anything back that might flag.
You should submit an issue, I think.
Yeah.
Or someone who's watching.
Yeah, whoever is watching, you got a chance to get an issue in, apparently, if this isn't one already.
You might get a free shirt for that or something like that. I'm just going to call it. I'm just going to say if you submit an issue, you might get a free shirt.
Engin was saying
you didn't have a t-shirt.
Well, Engin will get a free shirt anyway if he comes by our booth. I'm going to hold one for you, Engin.
Perfect. So go ahead.
I also wanted to mention that I was just collecting like list of people that submitted pull requests for vCluster, and I'm planning to reserve a vCluster t-shirt for each one that that will be at KubeCon Europe. So that's another chance to get a t-shirt. Send us a pull request.
All right, so there you go,
There's
folks.
a cool little feature that I really love in it too, in vCluster. When you do an upgrade at the command line, it shows you in the output who the new contributors are that had PRs that got merged in that release, and I always love that when I see the the new folks submitting stuff.
Oh, that's cool. So it flags it like first issue or first PR or something.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. So that actually brings up another thing. What about the future of vCluster? I mean, we've been talking about implementation. We've gone pretty deep on some of the nitty gritty of what works and how do different things work? How do those different components come together? What about the roadmap? And what are maybe separately, I should ask, what are the most highly requested features? And then what's the roadmap actually look like? Are there some long running feature requests that have been sitting there for like 3 years? Because Argo CD has some of those. We have some of those feature requests that have been around a long time, gathering momentum. What are some of the most highly requested features of vCluster?
Hey, Oleg, that's a question for you, I think.
I'm looking at the issues right now. So make vCluster run as non-root by default. Yeah, has a lot of upvotes. I think another one is add OpenShift support, but this is not for running vCluster on OpenShift because that works. This is for having OpenShift as a distro of vCluster. So one of the things that vCluster allows is to use different images for the API server, controller manager, and like core DNS. You can customize it a bit. So we have K3s as default, K0s, we have vanilla Kubernetes, and we have EKS. And yeah, seems like a few people would like OpenShift as well, but this one is pretty tough.
That would be tough. Yeah, this is the Kubernetes that's running inside of the virtual cluster itself. Like you can use different ones.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, there's actually an interesting use case there as well, because if I could spin up different distributions of Kubernetes, that could be allowed me to do some different testing. Though I think it might be somewhat limiting, because if I wanted to test like GKE versus EKS, like you're not going to. There's no way
that's not going to be a realistic test without the rest of the infrastructure there and everything.
You're not going to give me the GKE storage classes and whatnot that
no one goes to GKE because of the Kubernetes distro, I don't think.
The EKS one actually. So originally when we started the project off, it was K3s was the one distro that was there. So everything used K3s, and then at some point, someone came to us and they wanted us to support K0s, and we looked at that and we're like, yeah, sure, and we added that, and then we did a stream a long time ago with Justin Garrison from AWS, the containers from the couch thing. And we were talking, the distro stuff came up in there. And then like 2 hours later or something, we had a PR from Justin adding EKS as the distro. And so that was super cool. That was one of my favorite community contributions to the project so far. And it just gives you the ability to have the Kubernetes running inside the virtual cluster be a little bit more like, the one that you're actually using in production, if you're using EKS, right?
So I've got my home lab here, right? It's running K3s. If I've got vCluster on here, can I run an EKS vCluster on this home lab?
Yes.
And it's going to be the same, 99% the same, or the same?
It's the same Kubernetes distribution they use. So it's the Kubernetes they install on EKS.
But I guess the way the load balancer would function maybe not be quite the same, because there's no ALB available. So if I request a service, it's going to rely on whatever the parent cluster is providing, which in my case is Metal LB. So it's going to do an IP address based on that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to be completely precise, it will use the container images built by AWS for API server, for controller manager, optionally scheduler, and I forgot the third component. But basically those main control plane things, components, and core DNS as well. It will use images built by AWS for those.
I mean, that's
But yeah, absolutely. The rest of the stuff isn't going to be there behind the scenes that you would rely on in AWS. But yeah, that's the idea, is that you just make things a little bit closer to what you're actually doing in production.
It would be pretty cool to have OpenShift, because the number one issue that people really run into is just like workload identity management in OpenShift is just tougher. But to be able to run that and test workloads against it, that would be, pretty nice. I mean, that maybe this is another CI/CD use case that CodeFresh needs to look into. Maybe there's a PR we could contribute to. I'm not signing up for it. I don't have time. But
doesn't OpenShift also have this like whole CI/CD based on Tecton thing, the OpenShift pipelines, right? I think that would also be pretty awesome.
Yeah, Red Hat, they have a CI based on Tecton. And then they for CD, they basically provide an operator for Argo CD to let people do that. I mean, it's not as cool as CodeFresh CI/CD pipeline.
Of course.
Yeah.
I mean, we already established that CodeFresh is the coolest.
Yes.
Like early.
We already acknowledged it. We don't need to have. Yeah. We don't need to. Yeah. We're good.
But if anyone from Google or Azure is watching right now, like it's your move. You could maybe submit a pull request in 2 hours, and then you can grab your free shirt at our booth.
Pull requests accepted on this one for sure.
Most open source projects don't even pay in T-shirts. So
except for Hacktoberfest, I guess that's when the T-shirt industry really goes wild.
That's right. So if those are some of the most highly requested features, what are maybe some of the things that are coming up on the roadmap? Is there anything that you're willing to share at this point about upcoming features?
Oleg, do you want to talk about roadmap stuff?
Yeah, I think I will first maybe mention like some of the features from recent releases that we are like still thinking about and wanting to improve upon. So one of the areas why vCluster is used in some of the use cases is like the optimization. Basically, of course, the control plane, you don't have to pay for that, but it allows some nice other optimizations as well. So, for example, you can let vCluster use ingress controller from the host cluster instead of installing ingress controller in each individual cluster, then setting up some, network, either, paying for a load balancer or setting up node ports and this sort of stuff. So that's like one of the built-in optimizations of the reuse of ingress that's been in vCluster for a long time. But we've been looking into like expanding, supporting different controllers, basically. So Lian mentioned Cert Manager is one of those that can be also reused between virtual cluster and the host cluster. So there is dedicated plugin for that we wrote. But also in the recent version, we've added sort of declarative YAML format, which would allow you to sync different custom resources and CRDs between the vCluster and the host cluster. So then you could theoretically have Argo running in the host cluster, and in the vCluster, people create those custom resources, and then vCluster takes care of, Argo in the host doing the work based on what's written in the custom resource and updating the status. And from the user's perspective, it should ideally look like, Argo is installed in this cluster. But in fact, like you are reusing what's installed in the host, so you can scale much cheaper. So this is one of the areas, like this sort of optimizations.
Wow, that's pretty interesting. So you basically are going to have the ability, or this is already out, is you now have the ability to basically specify components that you want replicated, meaning exposed within these vClusters. And Argo CD is especially an interesting one because I could...
I just throw it out. I didn't test it, to be honest. I
but-
just as an example, of
But when you were
tool
talking
that
about
uses CRDs.
Oh, sorry. When you were talking, Dan, about stuff that got requested, right? Initially when we put vCluster out, a lot of the edge cases that came up, or a lot of the questions that people had, were around this idea of sharing resources, right? In either direction, being able to share something from the host cluster to the virtual clusters, or from the virtual cluster to the host cluster. I think more from the host to the virtual clusters, but so we came up with this plugin framework, and it's pretty cool, and you can customize the way that the syncer works. But the problem with that is that the plugins are kind of difficult to write, right? You've got to write Go, and it's kind of an intense process. And so, like Oleg said, we've been trying to come up with ways to make it easier to do that sort of resource sharing, without having to be a Go programmer. So you could just specify the stuff in YAML instead.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, this brings me to another topic. Did you guys catch the talk by Mike Tugeron at KubeCon last year, or it might have been
The thousands of clusters sitting in a tree one?
Yes, that's exactly the one I was thinking of.
Yes, we did. I think all of us did.
Yeah.
And maybe for the audience, you want to summarize that talk? It just came to mind as one that I was a little bit familiar with.
I think I think Mike is also from Adobe, if I'm not mistaken, and he was talking a bit more in depth about basically what you and Joseph were talking about, but like on an in-depth technical level. And he was just basically showing kind of how he is spinning up thousands, tens of thousands of vClusters through the CI/CD pipeline that he also showed a bit, but then you were discussing it further in like a broader context. And I don't know. I think I don't feel like I'm doing it justice by talking about it, because I feel like it's something you really need to see, because that was pretty amazing, and it's a great talk. Definitely.
I've seen a few of Mike's talks, and so I've just having trouble remembering specifically which one that was. He did a thing at Cloud Native Rejects. He and I both spoke there, and he.
I think it might be the same one, actually.
Yeah, he was spinning up a bunch of clusters in that, and he was nesting them, right? And so at one point he went like 18 layers deep of virtual clusters, but unfortunately it turns out they were actually having an incident in Azure while he was giving his talk, and there was a problem with the load balancers, and so he wasn't able to take it quite as far as he would have liked to, but it was still really fun to see. Super cool.
I don't remember him hitting a limitation. Like, it seemed like he was able to pretty much just keep adding.
Yeah, it could be a different talk then from the Rejects one.
I think it happened at Rejects, but not at GitOps Con. I think he gave the talk at GitOps Con, which is one of the co-located events in Detroit. I don't think he hit that limit in Detroit or like at GitOps Con. But I think it was a very similar talk, at least.
Theoretically, there's no limit in nested vClusters. You could just continue nesting vClusters. I'm not sure there's an advantage to nesting vClusters versus, because it's like, well, they're already sitting within a parent cluster. I already have isolation. I mean, I guess I could do some additional inheritance. So maybe like I could have like this vCluster and all of its child clusters get this security policy, and this one and all its child clusters get a different security policy. Something like that I could see, but like ultimately nesting 10,000 times turtles all the way down, I can't think of it.
No, that was just he was just messing around, really, just showing that it could be done. But I think he also, at least in the version that I saw at Rejects, was talking some about performance too, right? And there didn't seem to be, from what I saw, a really big performance impact to doing that. I think you could potentially do something like what you even sort of what you were talking about earlier, right? Where you've got a big cluster, a real cluster, and you just put one virtual cluster inside of it because that's easy to manage, you could potentially be in a situation where you have a few different use cases and you just want to give them all their virtual clusters so you could tear the whole thing down at once. That's one really nice thing about it is because everything lives inside this one namespace, for the virtual cluster. It's really, really easy to tear them down and get rid of all of the resources.
Now, if I'm spinning up vCluster, basically, I think the way it works, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's been a little while since I looked at it, but I thought I basically deployed a custom resource definition and a controller, and then if I wanted to add an additional vCluster, I basically would just create an additional custom resource. Is that right? And then it would spin up the cluster.
Yeah, that would work with the cluster API provider, vCluster, or with Loft, our commercial product. But yeah, the vCluster project on it itself just provides the Helm charts or the CLI for creation, upgrades, and so on.
Yeah. So if I want to create additional clusters, now in the case of CodeFresh, we use Crossplane to actually manage those resources.
Yeah.
I've seen Cluster API be used as well. What's the benefit of using an infrastructure management tool like that versus just deploying a vCluster directly using either the CLI or just throwing the custom resource up onto the cluster?
I mean, I think it's going to be really the same as, the same answer as to like why you would want to use infrastructure as code, right? It's really just about standardizing things, making them repeatable, that sort of thing. If you're just doing one-off stuff, like when I'm just messing around on my laptop or something and I want to vCluster, I use the CLI every time because that's just so super easy to use. But in a situation where you're in something that's more of a shared environment, I think that using like a GitOps workflow with the Helm chart or using the cluster API provider are both really great ways to go.
It's amazing for onboarding purposes as well, because you could just give people a cluster that's already prepared. They don't have to understand, like how things need to be configured on the cluster. And I also just want to like plug the keynote demo thing by Whitney Lee and Mauricio Salatino. That was also at KubeCon Detroit, and they showed this amazing demo where I think the talk was about deploying directly to production, but in a safe way. And they were showing how they were spinning up like ephemeral environments for the CI/CD pipeline they were showing. And they were using Crossplane and Cluster API and vCluster, if I'm not mistaken. Again, go check it out because it's a really fun talk.
Yeah, so it was like developers would just define, what they wanted their environment to look like in YAML, like the name of it and things like that, some basic values. And then Crossplane picked that up and would then deploy the vCluster. It was really cool.
Yeah, all these scenarios, like getting development environments, getting CI/CD environments, seem to be enabled by this because the automation is simplified and managed in a predictable way. The other thing, have you seen? There's been a little bit of noise around trying to do cloud development environments in Kubernetes. So you have a tool like Code that you can basically deploy VS Code and do a Kubernetes cluster and get a development environment. It's basically just running containers on the back end. Is that something you've seen people combine with vCluster? Obviously, you could to create some additional like isolation layers, or is that something that's doomed to fail? Is dumb? I mean, it's a little bit of a side topic, but I've tried it and I thought, oh, this is cool. And honestly, the main reason that I was interested in it was because I have an iPad Pro. And I thought, oh, here I can get like a full development environment.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I ended up just deciding I'm just going to use my laptop because it's less work than trying to do this.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't seen it specifically with vCluster, but I definitely don't think it's a dumb idea. I think that like one of the things that's really cool nowadays is that there are a lot of different ways to make these development environments, right? And people have different workflows. They have different requirements. I've heard from people who work at companies where they can't even install Docker on their laptop, they're just not allowed to do that by the company's security policies. And so there's so many different use cases out there that engineering teams have that I think for some people, I'm sure that sort of scenario where they're using, code, with one of those sort of dedicated environments is really helpful.
I mean, you already have tools like Gitpod, where I believe that they spin up
Yes.
like a remote environment for you, and that works really well for a lot of people who don't want to run like a super expensive. Like I'm running Docker Desktop sometimes, and then I can't do anything else. I have to close down Slack. It's a whole thing.
It would be cool. I could see a scenario where I was using maybe vCluster with Gitpod, and I was basically like changing the amount of resources I need for the project I was working on. So I was basically like, hey, I need like the best GPU we got. I'm going to be doing some machine learning stuff on my machine. And so being able to like kind of provision that up and have it just be available. And then most of the time, I'm not going to be requesting the GPU. I'm not going to be requesting 64 gigs of RAM. I'm going to just need like, give me just like the small one today, because I'm just going to be doing some simple stuff.
It has been funny, because like, I was working really closely with Java developers back in the 2000s, and at that point it was all local development, right? Like everybody, I mean, there was a shared dev server, but most of the people were running, multiple services, Java services on their laptops, and it was really painful. And I think that there was a lot of excitement about remote development to get away from the problems with that sort of scenario. And now I feel like in the same way as microservices, we're sort of seeing a little bit of a correction, that there are people now who are like, well, maybe I could just use my laptop instead of having to have a shared environment on a EKS cluster that's managed by the IT team or whoever. So it's kind of funny to me.
Yeah, I remember years ago, I was doing some web development work. I was a full stack engineer, and I was doing some web development work, and I needed to be able to run like several virtual machines for different testing that I was doing. And I made my machine request to the IT organization. I told them the specs that I wanted, and I got it rejected. And the quote was gratuitous. His request is gratuitous, and we will not honor it. And my boss was like, is this a gratuitous request? And I was like, only if you don't value my time. I can be twice as efficient with this than I could be with what I have. So if it's worth it to spend thousands of dollars to save, an extra $2,000 on this machine for the year, then.
I mean, I think the other piece of that too, is, we talk about this a lot. I know I've heard Lian talk about it a lot too, is like that idea of developer happiness, right? And if like spending this little bit of extra money is going to keep you from being miserable about your job, then maybe it has a much bigger impact in the long term, productivity wise.
Yeah, I wonder if this is going to stick around. I mean, this is a bit of a tangent, but I was visiting a friend at Dropbox a few years ago, and they, obviously they had amazing lunches and all the cushy, nice. I mean, we're working from home now, so I have fantastic lunches. I make bacon myself. I make it from scratch. I cure it in my fridge. I smoke it myself. So I'm doing great on lunches. But they had these vending machines with keyboards and laptops and $300 headphones, and they didn't take payment. You just walked up and scanned your badge and told it what you wanted. And I was like staring at this. And at the time I was working at Atlassian, and they had a closet that was like, you could go in there and you could grab a handful of batteries. That was their equivalent of like the self-serve. But Dropbox had these vending machines. You could just walk up and scan and get like $300 headphones or whatever. And I asked my friend about it, and he was like, well, they just figure that if you need headphones or you need one of these things, it would be cheaper to not have your employee take the time off to walk down the street to buy something and then go through and reimburse it and all this stuff than it would be just have a vending machine sitting here. And I was like, do people like ever like, buy a bunch and just sell it? And he was like, I don't think so.
They probably could tell,
they probably
right?
did.
Like if you could order like 20 of them. But I think that
he's always coming in with a few trench coats.
Yeah,
Sorry,
I mean it's cool that you brought up self-service, because I'm a really big believer in it, and it's actually one of the reasons why I came to work here at Loft Labs. Like our commercial product Loft is really meant to enable these ephemeral virtual cluster environments for developers, self-service, right? So a developer can just go and get themselves an environment really quickly. And I mean, for many years, I was on both sides of it, right? Where I was that person who had a ticket to do work for someone else, that I hadn't gotten to yet. And I was also the person who was waiting on someone else to do the work for the ticket that I submitted, and that sort of stuff, like we said, it goes way beyond just wasted time, right? It's like, what sort of impact does that have on people's morale, even, and their happiness, like when they're sitting around like blocked from doing an important thing because somebody else just hasn't gotten to their task yet. So yeah.
Well, so
I don't want to.
Go ahead.
I don't want to go too deeply into the topic of developer platforms because I feel like it's become a marketing term, really. But I think the idea of autonomy, really giving people the power to do whatever they would want to with their cluster, while still making sure that they are not going to break anyone else's cluster. That level of autonomy really empowers developers to go for it and try things and optimize if they want to. If they don't, they don't have to. But I'm always a proponent of giving people the most amount of context and autonomy that you can, and then let them just run with it, because you might be surprised about of what people would be willing to do or capable of doing if you just let them.
Yeah, I doing this. I mentioned doing Argo CD security testing and performance testing using vCluster. And one of the things I did is I basically just set up a auto scaling cluster. And then I told it to spin up 20,000 vClusters, right? And I remember thinking at the time, do I need to talk to somebody before I do this? Is there somebody I should check with? And what I actually did is I checked in with my wife and I said, for the next 6 hours, I'm going to be burning cash, on a pile of, on a fire. And so if there's anything that you're going to need me for in the next 6 hours, let's make sure that I'm going to be enabled to go and make sure I tear this thing down as soon as I can, because it's just going to be burning through cash. And I think I posted a meme at the time that was the Interstellar, when they're oh, this little maneuver is going to cost us 20 years. And it was this little maneuver is going to cost me the equivalent of here it is. I found it actually. Here you go. I'll throw it up on the screen. It was 200 clusters to test 10,000 apps. This little maneuver is going to cost us 48 vCPUs and 256 gigs of RAM. Yeah.
Super funny.
So yeah, letting that run. And then, ultimately the stuff was running for 40 minutes. So it wasn't that long. But compared to what I usually spend, so it wasn't that expensive of a test overall to do it. But it definitely it was good to be enabled to just take advantage of what I needed to do. So okay, this brings us to as we're heading towards the back end of this stream, I wanted to ask you about Loft Enterprise. And I've used Crossplane a lot for free. I've gotten a lot of free value out of using Crossplane beyond just t-shirts and water bottles, but doing performance testing, all this stuff, I'm able to do that without paying for any additional product. So could you give maybe a 2-minute overview of, this is, we expect people to be using this for free. This is the point at which we would recommend coming in and using Loft Enterprises. And these are the benefits you're going to get.
I think that, that you could build your own Loft, right? You could take vCluster and put in a bunch of engineering time and, in essence, end up building your own thing. But it's just that classic build versus buy argument, right? Is it worth spending the time to duplicate all this work that we've already done, Loft does a lot of things. It like hooks into your authentication, and so you can do SSO, things like that. It provides these virtual clusters. It also provides namespaces. There's a lot of stuff that you can do in it. And again, I think especially that part of the on-demand environments for developers, the fact that there's, either through the CLI or the GUI, someone can request one of these virtual clusters and have it within a few seconds and get up and running is something that you could build tooling to do, but it would be pretty complicated and a lot of effort to do that.
I think I would describe Loft as like the developer platform on top of our open source projects like vcluster. And then we also have stuff like Kiosk and JS Policy that are all supposed to or trying to make like multi-tenancy on the same shared cluster a bit more frictionless, I would say. And Loft really gives you kind of that level where you don't even need to really understand how to like what a vcluster actually is. Like all the stuff that we talked about now, as an engineer, like as a software developer, you might not be interested at all. And you could just use Loft, and as Rich said, just like on demand, go through the UI, just click whatever you want, whatever you need. And then, you just never have to actually touch Kubernetes at all from your point of view. So I think if this is like, especially if you want to scale up, and again, the onboarding experience, being able to get people to, just start coding really quickly. And also with the new version that's currently still in beta, we have like fantastic integration with Argo CD. We have like a feature for creating preview environments out of your CI/CD. And it's just like bringing all the things that we already have with the open source projects to the next level, like make it even nicer.
Yeah,
we're actually a day early. Like we're about to have a big product launch, and I don't know how much of it is embargoed, and so I don't know how much I can talk about. But
you can. Sorry, folks. This is why I said I'm still working in your team. We'll have to talk about it tomorrow. But the docs are already out, so I was.
Yeah. No, I didn't mean that you broke the embargo. I'm just saying I personally don't know what I can say and what I can't today, but we do have this big new release that's rolling out tomorrow, and it's going to be pretty exciting. So
is there going to be a blog post, or is there going to be a live event that we should be looking at?
There is definitely going to be a blog post. So like if you go to loft.sh, it's going to be on the blog. We'll certainly be posting about it on Twitter and LinkedIn too.
And there is going to be a live stream as well.
Oh, that's right. There is.
Yes.
Okay. So follow loft _sh on Twitter for that. So you can see what's going to be announced tomorrow. I did see that you had, and I'll post a link to that in the chat. I did see the Argo CD integration, which I thought was really cool because you can basically just tell it to spin up a Loft instance and it will automatically register it with an Argo CD instance that's already running. And I don't think it will provision an Argo CD instance. I think it just connects it to an existing one. And presumably that would work with CodeFresh, the self-hosted one that I have. I would just be able to connect up and spin up and run these. And this is actually something that Mike Tugeron had done with Argo workflows, where he had created a workflow that monitored for an event of a cluster to be created and then would automatically add it to Argo CD. But of course, he had to hook up all that piping. Whereas in this case, it's like a checkbox. I enabled Loft.
Yeah. I mean, I think that this is probably in terms of, we were talking about use cases earlier and what people ask about. And I think that like, it's a very common question. Like, how do I build preview environments, easily? And this kind of tooling can definitely help with that.
Okay. Well, so we're coming to the end here. What do we have to plug? We mentioned the launch tomorrow that people should obviously check out. And you're going to be at KubeCon EU in April. Maybe you're going to be at GitOpsCon in May.
We're actually going to be at Scale this weekend. So if folks are heading down to Los Angeles for Scale, I'm going to be there. Our CEO, Lucas, and a couple other folks from the team. So we would love to say hi. It's Scale and KCD LA. So we'll be watching some talks and hanging out. So please come say hi.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so scale. Obviously, Rich, people can find you on Twitter at Rich Burroughs. Lian, we can find you at Lian Makes Things, and Oleg at Matskiv. And any other parting words you want to add or plugs you want to make?
No, just thanks for having us on. Oh, go ahead, Lian, if you've got one.
come to our booth. We're gonna be at Rejects as well, probably, and come to my karaoke party at KubeCon also, please. That's all I have to plug.
You have a karaoke party you're doing?
I always have a karaoke party. Always, every
Is it
single
just
time.
at the
I think
booth, or is it?
it's at a karaoke bar. It's in it's in Amsterdam Center. So if people don't know, I'm based out of Amsterdam, and I've been going to this karaoke bar for the last probably 5 years. And yeah, it's going to be really fun. So I will put up more information. Oh, maybe this is the time for me to plug the karaoke, the first and only Kubernetes karaoke community, which is called Kuberoki. So you can check that out on kuberoki.love. Thanks for giving me the time to plug this.
So Kuberoki, I got to try to find it. Kuberoki.
Kuberoki.love.
I don't think I know how to spell it properly.
It's
Kuberoki.
Okay.
Kuberoki.love. Okay, Kuberoki.love. Okay, I found it. Putting it
Awesome.
up here. This is the only.
Check out the amazing logo. This is the proudest thing. I'm so proud of this logo. This is the best thing.
So what makes Kuberoki? What makes it Kubernetes? Is it just that the participants are Kubernetes, or are all the songs Kubernetes themed?
Oh no! Please no, not at all. It just happens that the Kubernetes community loves karaoke. I had no idea, but that's just what happened.
Okay, well there you go. So the answer is get into that Kuberoki. And Lian, can we ask, are you gonna post, since you're native to Amsterdam, are you gonna post a things you don't want to miss in Amsterdam?
100%. I already recorded like a teaser video with like cool places in Amsterdam. I'm gonna write a blog post, like where do you need to go, what do you need to avoid, like don't walk on the bike lane, stuff like that. So yeah, definitely.
Brilliant. I haven't been to Amsterdam in years. So, and when I went, I felt like I didn't know what to look for. So I'm going to check out your guide and follow that. Awesome. And I'm looking forward to it. So with that, thank you so much for joining us. Let's see, last few things to pitch for the future to be aware of. If you haven't checked this out yet, you can follow all CodeFresh events that are upcoming at codefresh.io/events. Next, coming up in April, we have Merging to Main, which is a really cool podcast run by Brandon Phillips, who's on the CodeFresh team. They're going to be covering, is GitOps just a fad? I hope the answer is no. Otherwise, we might have to change the name this stream.
A really long fad.
You can see one that was just done, was Merging to Main, modernizing your CI/CD. That was a very good one. So I definitely recommend checking that out. And then there's going to be some additional events added here. So check those out. If you aren't already, also, we always mention the CodeFresh GitOps certification. If you haven't gone and gotten GitOps certified, that's going to take me somewhere else. This certification is the most popular certification for GitOps and the fastest growing one in the world. I think we have over 16 or 18,000 students at this point. So go get GitOps certified with Argo CD. There's live lab environments that will teach you everything you need to know to implement GitOps. There's a level 1 fundamentals course, and there's a level 2 GitOps at scale course. They'll teach you how to organize your repositories, how to do progressive delivery, how to handle pre-sync and post-sync operations, all those kinds of event hooks. It really gets deep into Argo, and you can do it all within these environments. So you're not having to spin up these resources and muck around with installing things. You can just focus on learning, and it's really very well reviewed. So definitely recommend that if you haven't done it. And with that, we're going to close the stream. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Be sure to tell your friends. Follow us all on Twitter. Put this out there. like and subscribe, whatever. You get it. So
hey, Dan, I just want to know when my lunch invite is coming. That bacon sounds really good.
yeah, lunch invite. We're gonna have to talk after this, and we're gonna make it happen, my friend, because the bacon is delicious. All right, so wave goodbye, everybody. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.